Freeport Speech as an organization donates all of the net proceeds of our events to worthy organizations. And in this particular case, this whole talk was really made possible when Joe Ishkamper and I were having a discussion about our friend Admiral Johnson and his experience from the Pentagon side about Ukraine. And Joe said, Tom, we should approach Susan Thornton, who I did not know at that point in time. And thanks to Joe, we put this all together for tonight. But the crowning piece of it was to add Harold PACHIOS as our moderator. I first saw Harold when he was interviewing Admiral Johnson on the same subject on his TV show, his local TV show, which gave me the initial idea. But Joe also made the suggestion, asked if we were aware, if I was aware or the board was aware of Partners for World Health. And that's how the whole thing germinated. And now we are just thrilled to let you know that tonight we've raised $11,000 as a result of the sponsorships and your ticket sales for Partners for World Health. I'd like to ask if Julie Forsyth, the Chief Operating Officer of Partners for World Health, could come up and give you a few words about it, but also acknowledge here tonight is the founder and CEO of Partners for World Health, Elizabeth McClellan.
Thank you very much, Tom. I will be brief as it is hot and there's a lot of wonderful conversation that's about to happen. Partners for World Health is a nonprofit based here in Portland, Maine. It was started 13 years ago by Elizabeth McClellan. And our mission is to collect medical supplies and equipment from hospitals, from healthcare centers, from individuals or other organizations that would otherwise be discarding them. And we repurpose them for those in need locally and internationally. The primary work that we do is we send 40-foot shipping containers of medical supplies all over the world to small health centers and clinics, mostly in the developing world. Another piece of our mandate is to address issues as they come up in crises around the world. And I'm very pleased to say that within 3 weeks of the war breaking out in Ukraine, we had secured partnerships in the country and we're shipping medical supplies to the people in need there in Ukraine. To date, we have shipped the value of about $2.3 million worth of medical supplies, and we're not done. Because the work that we do isn't just about addressing a crisis, it's about dealing with what is a chronic situation throughout the world, the lack of access to healthcare, to supplies, the basics that we all need in order to live and to thrive in the world. And so we're really pleased by the fact that we have the partnerships with hospitals here in New England who help us to collect those supplies. We have supporters like you here this evening. Thank you for your generous support for the work that we do. 98% of what we do is done by volunteers. So anyone looking for a little bit of opportunity, have a little extra time, please come and see us. But I just want to say thank you because the work that we do is important. It helps keep items out of landfills. It helps get them to people who need them. And we all need to take care of our planet and each other, and we're proud to be able to do that. So thank you very much. I have more information on the outside of the room here if you'd like to learn anything more about us, but thank you again for your support.
Just one more housekeeping thing, and that is that our next talk is August 17th, Wednesday. Hopefully it'll be a cooler evening. We're honored to have Professor Kara Palamountain and Dr. Nirav Shah, who will be talking. That discussion will be moderated by Dora Mills, Dr. Dora Mills. We encourage you to pick up your tickets. They're available on our website, freeportspeech.org, or on Eventbrite. Some of our future speakers, we don't have the date to set as yet, We are welcoming three great environmentalists here: Susanna Hancock, David Shaw, and Ian Kerr, who will be, hopefully this fall, will be speaking on the environment, especially the saving of our oceans. I could recite things that you've probably all read about our three speakers. I could probably talk about the three speakers for the next hour and a half, but that's not why you came here. Beginning with Admiral Johnson, I have to tell you that I met him in Italy when he was so starved for people from Maine that he was invited to an Italian dinner, and he said, aren't there any Americans or anybody from Maine around? And I got invited, and that's how we met. I did find out the interesting factoid that Admiral Johnson, Grog, as we all know him, was a Navy pilot, and your handle sticks with you for the rest of your career. Little did they know that that kid from the county in Maine, that pilot from the county in Maine, would end up as a four-star admiral, and then even more than that. But Grog had the practice of checking his young sailors' social security numbers of everybody under his command, so he could find the ones that were from Maine, or at least born in Maine. And then he would personally contact them. Some young recruit would get a message from 3 or 4-star Admiral Johnson because he was another kid from Maine. Susan Thornton had an illustrious career with the State Department. In fact, she was the expert at the State Department, both on the Soviet satellite states and on China and East Asia. Those are so very, very impressive, but what impressed me the most is that she played left defense on the Bowdoin College hockey team, and I played left defense on the Colby College hockey team. Fortunately, we didn't play against each other because she would have embarrassed me. And last but not least, Harold PACHIOS is an institution here in Maine. I had the good pleasure or honor of introducing Harold PACHIOS to Admiral Johnson in Naples, Italy, when he was at least a member, if not the chair, of the Commission on Public Diplomacy. And Harold had a history with, he was something like that blonde lady who was on TV last night, who was Kayleigh McEnany's chief deputy. I think that the circumstances of working for Bill Moyers versus working for Kelly McElhaney were a little different. But without any further ado, the three of them, the stage is yours, the evening is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, tonight we wanted to, I think we're going to achieve something very elusive. The perfect juxtaposition of military power and diplomacy. Admiral Johnson, as you all know, he was at one time commander of the U.S. Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean, commander of U.S. Naval Forces Europe, and NATO commander of all Allied forces in Southern Europe. And this command, as we're talking about Ukraine, this command is described as being responsible for conducting the full range of military operations throughout the NATO area of responsibility and beyond in order to deter aggression and to contribute to the effective defense of NATO territory and forces, which is one of it's the military subject tonight. And so he knows a lot about protecting NATO. While Ukraine is not a NATO country, the NATO countries are involved and they're our own neighbors. And he knows a lot about the Black Sea and naval operations in Eastern Europe. So this is really right up his alley. And Susan was the acting Assistant Secretary of State for Near East, Asia, and Pacific. and that's one of the most senior diplomatic positions in the U.S. Foreign Service and in the Department of State. And she's an expert on Russia. She was an expert on Russia before she went into the Foreign Service. I hope you began being an expert on Russia at Bowdoin College.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, good. And she speaks Russian. If there are any Russian spies in the room, you can talk to her in your native language when this is all over. She also speaks Mandarin Chinese fluently. She has spent a good deal of time working in the republics of the former Soviet Union, Deputy Chief of Mission in Turkmenistan. She served in our embassies in Armenia and Kazakhstan, and before joining the Foreign Service, she worked at the Foreign Policy Institute as an expert on Russia. Admiral Johnson is a graduate of the Naval War College, and don't think he's the only one who knows anything about war, because our diplomat is a graduate of the National War College. So I thought we'd begin by asking each of them to address a broad question, and that'll get us off into talking about this subject and many sub-subjects. To Admiral Johnson, can the Ukrainians achieve sufficient military success to make the Russians come to the table, to force them to the table, and do the subset of that is, do the Ukrainians actually have the military capacity to force the Russians out of the Ukraine?
Well, Harold, thank you for the question, and the answer is twofold. The short answer is yes, I hope so. The realist answer is no, I don't think so. We've here in the first place because of 20 plus years of fecklessness on the part of not only the United States, but the Western democracies, NATO, and what have you. We never firmly used the word, and of course my Russian's not very good, but I think it's spelled N-Y-E-T, yet, in any demonstrative way with Mr. Putin since he became the president, and then was prime minister, and then became the president again for life. And every time he made a bold move, we said, well, that's Putin being Putin. But he told us what his problems were with us in 2007 at the Verkunda conference. And he's held to that, and each time he moved into Georgia or Crimea or into Syria, watched our pullout of Afghanistan, he believed that we were going soft and that he could get away with it. And I don't know, I won't ask for a show of hands how many thought that on the 23rd of February you would have bet your bottom dollar that he was going to invade. But he did, and we've been late. We were late all over those 20 years before it, and that's why we're there. And the things that we have done, we've been shooting behind the rabbit the entire time. For instance, HIMARS are just getting there. They could have made a difference. But once you have territory, and he's gotten a lot of territory, the reality is it's going to be very, very difficult to change facts on the ground. And it would take the West supporting in a much more aggressive way than it has been so far Ukraine for an extended period of time. And quite frankly, I don't think the West and the United States has the will to do that. So sadly, the answer is they will eventually come to a point where I'll turn it over to Susan, but there'll be some kind of a diplomatic way out of this, but it isn't going to be one that includes a return to what the situation was on the 23rd of February.
Susan, what's Putin's path out of this? Because all national leaders are really forced to follow a path that gives consideration to politics at home, their strength, their political strength at home. What's Putin's path here?
So I think all the leaders involved are dealing with their politics at home. Certainly, maybe Putin has less politics at home, and that's how he got himself into this situation. I think, he made a huge miscalculation. I think he's, probably to some extent, Russia has already lost as far as, Putin's original strategic goals, what he thought he was going to be able to get away with, how quickly he thought he was going to be able to get away with it. He has, I think, very much miscalculated the sort of long-term grave situation he's gotten Russia into with the rest of the world, especially the Western world. And we can talk a little bit about what the differentiation is among different countries in the globe in terms of how they view the situation. But certainly the Western world will now have ostracized Russia, cut them off from international financial, banking, trade, and other things. And I think that is really something that Putin didn't expect. So whereas Grog has said we were late, I mean, one of the things that we did do right off the bat and had a good advanced plan in place for was to put in place these blanket sanctions that were really surprising, I think, to Putin and threw him off his guard. Now, the problem is these sanctions aren't going to stop his tanks from rolling forward, his troops from rolling forward, et cetera. And so it's a longer term kind of pain we're trying to inflict on Russia. I think Putin, the Russian people, the Russian, sort of leadership, elite, they do feel a lot of regret over the post-Cold War settlement that they were saddled with at a time when Russia was, let's admit it, very, very weak. And, Putin has been dissatisfied with this all along since 1991 when the settlement, basically the collapse of the Soviet Union happened and the settlement was then sort of foisted on leaders in Russia. We had a very weak leader in Boris Yeltsin. Putin was chosen as his successor, and he's been sort of, nursing these grievances ever since. And I think, we've known about this, as Grog said, in 2000, and I think it was 2007, the Bucharest summit, where, after I think George W. Bush said that Georgia and Ukraine were going to have a path to join NATO, Putin went on his sort of well-known rant speech about how that should never happen, and then invaded Georgia in 2008. So this has been coming on for a long time. I think, getting a diplomatic way out of it is going to take time. Eventually, what we probably see developing, and there's, I think, been discussions in front of Congress in hearings recently, the three scenarios are sort of long-term stalemate, drag-on sort of fighting, movement of territory here and there. Can the Ukrainians get some momentum going to push the Russians out of where they are now and try to get to the negotiating table that way? Or will the Russians actually make big gains and then the Ukrainians will have to sue for negotiations? My personal view is the stalemate is the one that's likely, because I don't see either side being easily able to get to say, I'm suing for negotiations at the moment. I mean, it's existential for Putin and it's existential for the Ukrainians. So I think, unfortunately, we see that there will be this kind of continuing sort of struggle and slog.
Grog, Susan says probably military stalemate, and coupled with the military stalemate, a diplomatic one, because people have to, in order to go to the table, they have to think they're going to get what they need. Do you agree that this about the stalemate, or do you think that the West, through its agents, the Ukrainians, will ultimately prevail and the Russians will retire as they did in Afghanistan 25 years ago?
Well, I think that Ukraine will continue to exist as a sovereign state, but I don't know if it's going to exist as a sovereign state at its pre-24 February borders. I think it's very hard to take back territory, and I think that I just came back from, Carol and I were in Europe for a couple of weeks in June, and we were in France, and certainly France and Germany on this particular issue probably have less strategic patience than the United States does. And when winter comes, as Susan mentions, the sanctions, as firm as they are now, will probably have to get firmer, and they'd have to stay in place for multiple years. So again, I said, I hope that I think it'll be a blemish on all of us if Ukraine does not exist as it did before on the 23rd of February, but I find a scenario where that can happen quite a challenge. I don't see that we have the wherewithal and the unity of purpose to see this through. I think there will be a stalemate, and eventually it will evolve slowly into some kind of a diplomatic discussion. And I don't know where the new border will be, but I think certainly the Donbass region and Ukraine, I don't think that's anything that will be negotiated. My hope is that they have access to the Black Sea, they have some deep water ports, and we'll see. I'd love to see them get everything back, but I don't see a scenario where that could happen.
What do you think, Susan?
Well, I think at this point, even President Zelensky has made a comment, I think, in the not too distant past about getting back to the pre-February 24th borders. So that does not include, of course, Crimea. And it wouldn't include parts of Donbass that had been taken before this latest invasion. I think if we could get back there, I think
that would be great.
You know, I mean, I'm not sure that we could say that the Ukrainian government and people would be satisfied with that, and they shouldn't be, but I think that would be a good possibility. If we could get there, then we could get to the negotiating table, presumably, and decide what to do about the other pieces that had been taken before February 24th. Yeah, I think, you know, we have this land bridge now, of course, between the Donbass and Crimea that has been taken by the Russians, and which they clearly very much value. I mean, I guess a question would be, you know, how easy would it be to hold that? And I'm not the military expert in the room, so I don't know. I guess, you know, I've heard people say it would be difficult to keep that because it's just a small, you know, land sort of channel. And if you have an insurgency coming from Ukraine, if it's a long, drawn-out kind of stalemate situation, that might be hard to hold. But nevertheless, it's clear that that's valuable to the Russians, and they won't give it up easily. So, and another question, I suppose, is how, you know, when we look at the tallies of troops on either side, the will to fight, certainly the Ukrainian will to fight has been incredibly impressive, and the will to fight on the part of the Russians, not so much. And how that'll develop, I would think, would also be important. But you got to affect the calculus of this guy Putin, who's not necessarily too sympathetic to what the poor guys in the trenches are feeling.
If we could get through the winter and the West stay united, it's going to be a cold winter, and we significantly increase the volume of support that we give them in hardware, and particularly something that we can do with their air defense, which we still haven't figured that out, then, you know, there might be some possibility, but that's 8 months from now, and that's almost a year from now. So difficult.
You're both saying, you know, that the means to get to the end is military in order to cause both parties to think that the end might be Ukraine giving up a little territory, Russia giving up on its major ambitions, and accepting a little territory. Is that what you're both saying?
Well, that's what I clearly heard in Europe when I was there last month. I mean, Macron has even said that. And so I think and the government in Italy just fell. A lot of that had to do with Ukraine. So again, hope isn't a good plan, and so that's why I'm a little bit pessimistic at this point.
So Susan, you know a lot about Russia. You know the language. You know the culture. You spent a lot of time there in the former Soviet Union. Is that enough for Putin? Does he stop? Is he able to stop by just getting back to the borders, pre-invasion borders?
Well, I mean, if he is pushed back to those pre-invasion borders, it's going to be very difficult for him to justify that to his people who've just sacrificed and had their, ability to travel and have, banking, change rubles into dollars to go anywhere outside of Russia. Some of them, their savings being really squeezed. I think it's going to be very difficult for him. So, I mean, the one question is, if this is an agreement that would be acceptable to Ukraine, which that would be a hard sell in Ukraine too, after all of the atrocities that we've seen during this war. I mean, they might have been willing to do that at one point, but the longer it grinds on, the more people die and the more destruction of their country. It's harder and harder to make the case to the Ukrainians, but it's also difficult, I think, to make the case to the Russians that this is going to be an acceptable outcome. And I think for the international community, it's going to be very hard for them to not keep Russia in the doghouse in a pretty semi-permanent way. So
you're both saying this is likely, nobody can be certain, to be a long, drawn-out affair.
Yeah, I think so, but I think the West has to stick together, and I think it's going to be hard. I think it's going to start to crumble. I think what we saw in Italy, we don't know what the full impact of the discussions that took place in Iran this week, how they're going to materialize. Is the drones going to be provided to Russia, which appears they can't make anymore because they can't get some of the electronics they need. So Iran has a pretty good set of drones. It would really be beyond the pale if Turkey sold them theirs, because they're selling them to Ukraine. I can't imagine that happening, but it'll be a long slog, and I don't know if we have the strategic patience and the willingness to give enough for them. We give just enough so they can't be defeated, but I don't know. We have not given them enough to be able to defeat the Russians. The Russians have a weak hand. They have bad demographics. They're using their minority troops primarily to do the nasty fighting, but they still have strategic dominance just because of geography.
They can't be defeated.
It's going to be pretty hard, yeah.
So now back to the long, drawn-out affair, and do you think America is kind of leading this coalition? The United States is leading the coalition. It's necessary for America to have a taste for the long, drawn-out war and the sacrifice. You read about it. I mean, there's many reasons for high gas prices, but this war is one of them. And one of the big issues in the coming midterm campaigns is, look what's happened. Look what these politicians who are in charge have done. They've driven up gas prices. Of course, we know that's all untrue, but a good segment of the electorate in the United States does not know it's untrue. So what will happen if, there's no more political will in the United States? We're talking about more, not just Donbass, but several of the port cities on the Black Sea will become Russian, and there will be ultimately an agreement, negotiations, and they'll end up with it. Am I crazy? Is that not going to happen?
well, I think it is. I mean, what Gronk said about the winter coming is important. It's not important only in the United States, where we'll maybe face higher energy prices, but the United States is actually not bearing the brunt of this situation. It's really the partners, as you mentioned, in Europe, if you go to Berlin, you see Ukrainian refugees arriving by the thousands. Poland, Moldova, all these other countries are really, hosting millions of people that have been displaced. And they're also really bearing the brunt of the economic dislocation. I think most estimates are that there'll be a recession in Europe. And then in Germany, because they're so over-dependent on Russian energy, they're telling their citizenry that they better, put on extra sweaters this winter and bundle up because it's going to be cold. And, that you can do maybe in a country where, there's a one-party, leadership. But in a democracy, it's really hard to tell people you got to bundle up for the winter. It'll affect domestic politics in a lot of countries. As you mentioned, the government in Italy's already fallen. So it will be hard to hold this Western coalition together the longer I think this drags on. And one of the things that I think we were talking about before the show is the difficulty that we always have of matching. Before we go into one of these situations, we don't think enough about where it's gonna end, or how we're gonna get out of it, or how long are we gonna be doing this, and what are the consequences of that. We're a little bit more on the front end. Everyone was, of course, rooting for the Ukrainians to defend their country, and God knows they've done a valiant job, and we all support and root for them, and we're trying to do whatever we can to help them. But there is this issue of, how far do we go to help them, which we haven't raised yet, but that's been a big issue too in the U.S. And I think, for President Biden and for people in Europe, and for our NATO partners, they don't want to cross a line where they escalate the whole thing and make it even bigger than it is now, which would be a disaster. So,
Yeah.
So I'm listening to what both of you are saying, and you're saying that talked about sanctions, and the effect on the Russian people, the ordinary Russians, and that's sacrifice. They're sacrificing because of this invasion and this decision of Putin. And you're talking about the West and the United States and whether we have staying power, because there are sacrifices involved there too. We're talking about fuel prices and so forth, and whether the winter is going to be warm or cold. So, seems to me, and I'd be interested in your comments, if it comes down to who has staying power, seems to me that the dictators have a great advantage over the democratically elected leaders. Comment on that?
Well, I think I would agree with that. There's turmoil. The European country that's done the most, Poland, because they've accepted so many refugees, but in terms of military power is the United Kingdom, but now they're in turmoil, political turmoil. The second and third largest countries in terms of military power in Europe, Italy and France and Germany, have done hardly anything. They've sent a few artillery pieces, and that's it. They've promised a lot, but they really haven't delivered it. So they really aren't doing that much. And from traveling around France for 2 weeks, they think that's tough, but Ukraine is just going to have to swallow hard and give it up. And I didn't see any big desire to help them a whole lot more. And I didn't go to Germany, but from reading, and I think that's kind of the sentiment there. And this winter, he's giving them just enough gas right now to take care of their daily needs in the summer. He's not allowing them to build any stockpiles for winter. He doesn't pump enough through. So will we have the staying power? I just think from our history over the last 20 years of fecklessness, I don't see us having the level of resolve. And the biggest thing I see is leadership. And Mr. Kissinger has a new book out on leadership, and he has 6 examples in there. But when you look at dynamic world leadership right now on the stage, we might not agree with them or like them, but there's quite a bit of dynamic leadership on the side that we don't particularly want to support, or nor do we want to see win. But by any measure that Freedom House uses, democracy in the world is in decline and autocracy is rising. And do we have the unity and sense of purpose and the kind of dynamic leadership in the West that can change that dynamic? And my assessment is that we're in a bit of a void in that particular area now. France has got elections coming up. UK is in turmoil. Italy's government just fell. We have elections coming up. And, you know, you go around to gas stations, like the dry cleaner we used in Florida just before we came home. She was an interesting piece of work, so I always used to like to have a conversation with her every time I went to pick up our laundry. And I asked her, and I knew her husband was a Marine, former Marine. He's deceased. And I asked her what she thought of Ukraine, and she lit off on a tirade about we had no business being there. She couldn't understand why we were involved overseas. And the more you ask, that's a part of the sentiment that's out there. So we all, I think everybody in this room, or the vast majority of us, is very much in the Ukraine camp. We're saddened by this state of affairs that has allowed this to happen, where a sovereign country could become in and just absolutely terrorized and torn apart. But what it takes to change that dynamic, it's not clear to me. You have the sense of purpose that we had in World War II, where we could stay together as an alliance and seek unconditional surrender. I don't think we're trying to get to a point of unconditional surrender, but to a point of driving Russia out of Ukraine. That's going to be a difficult military task, combined with the sanctions staying in place without any leaks or anything in it. And just this grain deal that's come out, it remains to be seen what's going to happen with that and what kind of conditions Russia will have in that in terms of sanctions. So it's complex. I don't know. I just don't see that we have the wherewithal to do it right now. So I'm pessimistic about it.
Susan?
Yeah,
you
there are a
pessimistic?
couple things. I mean, I think, so one thing is, you know, Ukraine's homeland has been invaded, and that is a powerful animating force and a powerful motivator. And it's not so easy, even if you have a dictatorship, to win if you're the invading force. And we've seen this, you know, in recent years, unfortunately, in our own sort of foreign policy history. And we have to acknowledge that President Zelensky in Ukraine has been just a force to be reckoned with in terms of his leadership and you know, mobilization, galvanization of kind of spirit. So if spirit counts and if leadership counts, you know, you got to put a lot of points, I think, in the Ukrainian column. And I think what Greg's speaking to is, you know, is spirit's not going to be enough to move the Russians out. We know that. So we got to make sure they have, you know, something to do it with, you know, the means to do it with. And the question is, it's a very tricky question, because it's not just about what can we give them, and we can give them some things. And I think there's A-10 Warthogs maybe on the way, or some fighter jets anyway, that they've been asking for a long time. Again, they've been asking for a long time, and we're finally just talking about maybe getting them there. But this line there about, you know, and I don't know how much we're still worried about whether or not Putin thinks this is a fight against NATO. I personally think Putin's fighting two wars. He's fighting a war against Ukraine, which is a military war, and he's fighting a war against the US, the West, NATO, that's a sort of political economic war. And so, you know, would he actually escalate to a military war with the NATO side while he's got this military war going on with Ukraine? I'm not sure. But I do think there is a line there, and he is a disruptor, and he is unpredictable, and he is a risk taker, as we've seen. So, you know, the caution that the Western NATO allies have shown in not tripping that line with a nuclear-armed former superpower who has a beef with us and has been shown to be able to act on it is not a small thing. And that is a big responsibility for the leaders in all those countries to take into consideration. And the problem also that Greg mentions is this kind of, I don't know, it's not, I mean, I think Americans are squarely behind Ukraine in this fight. So, but the question is, how much will we sacrifice, which is what he's been
Yeah.
talking about. And also this notion that it somehow has nothing to do with us. And that is a mistake of, I think that's a failure of leadership. And it's a failure of, frankly, I think the US media, if I can say so. I mean, this is an issue. We galvanize our populations behind things all the time that are transnational problems that we all need to face together. And this is one of those. I mean, this is not unrelated to your daily life. We start to see the international system, we set up all these institutions. People like to mock them, the UN, various international organizations, but they're really important in keeping order in our daily lives around the world. And if we don't have them, we have things like blockading of fertilizer, grain, gasoline, energy, all the things that are happening now when you see sort of these norms and rules and institutions that we've set up start to weaken and collapse. And so I think it's not right for Americans to say this has nothing to do with us. But there is, a lot of complicated questions about what can we do, what should we do, and what will result in getting us to a negotiation table. And that's where we want to get. We want a ceasefire and a negotiation.
Well, let me throw this out to you. This isn't about foreign relations, but we live in a country which is totally divided, and we are led by politicians who want to stoke fear and opposition and sometimes not tell the truth. So what you said is all nice about leadership and so forth, but assume for the moment we don't have those kinds of leaders in America today, and it's just going to be how can one side take advantage of the situation 5,000 miles away and help them politically. So that's a fact of life. So what I'm hearing from you folks, and maybe you can take us back in a little bit in another direction, is we may not have the staying power, and if we don't have the staying power, the Germans, the French, and others are getting a little soft on this. The Ukrainians are not. Their homeland has been invaded, and we have seen Vietnam being the best example I know of from my time of what happens when you're fighting a war on somebody else's turf, and they live there and their families live there. It doesn't end. Yeah. It doesn't have to end. So there's no World War II surrender. So.
Well, first of all, I think the Ukrainians have been incredibly courageous and have fought with great valor and way beyond anything that we ever imagined. I also think that the Russians were a bit of a Potemkin military, and it showed, and they still are. And they could be defeated, but again, we have not given our friends in Ukraine enough support to where they can drive them back. And so I think politically in the United States, we don't have a time where we have enough national unity. During the Cold War, we had this an overarching strategy of containment, and that thread continued into the early 90s, from Republican to Democratic administration. And there were changes and what have you, but we still had this larger strategic vision, and that kept the country focused. And when that went away, we've searched. I've been on all kinds of studies about trying to come up with a grand strategy for the United States of America. We don't really have one, and now we're in a politically divided country, and we don't. I don't want to say it's a lack of leadership, but the ability to coalesce people and get people to realize that the diminishment of democracy in Ukraine is fundamentally important to the maintaining democracy in America, which I think it is. I think it's and I think it's a horrible thing that's happened, and I'd like to walk it back. But I think, unfortunately, we're living in a period of our history, both in the United States but in the world, where we don't have that thread like containment that can bring people together in a coherent way, all like-minded nations, to get rid of this threat. And so that's why I like to think I'm an optimist, but on this particular time, at this, at this particular moment in our history, we're, you know, it goes up and down, and we're in one of these
The threat of climate
valleys.
change. Why can't that bring us together?
Yeah.
So,
So,
Susan, can you, do you see the possibility of this ending in a way that avoids two things? One, giving sufficient concessions, conceding enough to the Russians that people say, oh no, we had the Truman Doctrine. We didn't, you know, concede in Eastern Europe to the Russians in 1947 and 48. And we succeeded. We stood firm and we succeeded. And now we're talking about concessions, and people say, well, gee, that's going to erode a rules-based world, which is probably eroded anyway. Can you see this ending where maybe it's not just the Donbass, because you suggest that that's not quite enough for Putin, but maybe a little bit more territory, and everybody gets sick and tired of fighting, and it's not good for the Ukrainians and their economy. Can you see it ending with a little bit more concession to the Russians?
Well, I think the problem right now is the Russians aren't interested in compromise or coming to the negotiating table. I think if the Russians were interested, the Ukrainians would go and hear what they have to say and start working on something. And there are a bunch of things on the table. It's not just territory. I mean, it's the disposition of kind of, you know, NATO forces in Ukraine, on Ukrainian territory. There's the EU accession. There are a number of other things that the Russians have expressed interest in over the years. So there are some things on the table that could be played with, but the Russians haven't, I mean, they're still working on the territorial expansion, right? And until we can somehow stop and at least stop that, I don't think they're going to be that interested in a ceasefire while they're making gains. But I do think once we got to a ceasefire, there are things to talk about. Whether they would be satisfied, it's very hard to say, and it's probably going to take a while to get there. You know, Putin, a lot of people talk about how important is Putin in all of this, and if Putin was to somehow miraculously go away, would the situation be dramatically different? And I think it would be different, certainly, possibly, but it wouldn't be maybe completely different as people like to think it would be, because I think Russian leaders, you know, now they're all invested in this adventure that Putin's taken them on. They're also very nationalistic, and they all have grievances about what's happened to Russia in the last 30 years.
The devil you know might be better than the one you don't know. Remember, they're the world's largest nuclear power. And they do have a declaratory policy called escalate to de-escalate. If they can feel their conventional forces are under threat, they'll lob a tactical nuclear weapon, which they believe there's such a thing as a tactical nuclear weapon, in the belief that the enemy, the West, that's us, would not respond in kind. And that's how they'll escalate using a nuclear weapon to de-escalate the threat to their conventional forces. And that's a declaratory policy in the Russian military strategy. So it's very complicated. I'm sure our leaders know all of that, and they have to take that into account. And so what I've seen is we're giving them just enough so they can't be defeated. And there will again be a sovereign state of Ukraine, but I'm not sure exactly what it's going to look like. That's my optimistic side. And then what Susan said at the beginning, what they were defeated initially. They couldn't get to Kiev, and they thought they could walk in and take over the whole country, and that didn't happen. So if you look at it from that perspective, there's been some positive things that have happened, but to be able to come forward with the level of effort it will take to change facts on the ground, that's very difficult. I hope in 10 years there'll be a bridge that they can walk across, just like they did in Afghanistan, and march out of there. But do you think we'll continue to support Ukraine? And do you think they have enough? You know, they only have 40 million people, 44 million people. And so we don't know exactly what their losses are, but it's been horrific. And they have fought bravely with a very difficult hand. And I applaud them, and I hope that we give them everything that we possibly can so that whenever there is a time to sit down at a table, they have the strongest possible hand. And I'm sure we have diplomats working on that. And if I were the West, I would have our Marshall Plan going, and we could be talking about how we're going to rebuild Ukraine and what have you, but you don't hear any of that. And so...
We're not worried about deficits now.
Yeah.
That's the issue. So, Susan, he drew back from the abyss a little bit in his assessment. End game. No one knows the end game. Not expecting either of you to know the end game. By using your best judgment, what do you think is maybe the most likely possibility? We know that there's no way for you to know, and we're not going to call you up next year and say, you know, I remember what you said.
Oh, boy. Okay, well, I do think there will still be a sovereign Ukrainian state. Putin will not be able to take all of Ukraine. There will be a government of Ukraine. I hope that, this candidacy for the European Union that has been mooted by the Europeans will go forward. I think that should be able to go forward in spite of whatever negotiations eventually reached with the Russians, because it's not threatening, it's an economic agreement. And, I think probably Crimea, that's a really complicated story and a complicated history. I don't think that's going back to Ukraine. I think the Donbass, there's a stalemate fight been going on there for the last 7-8 years. That's probably part of the Donbass, at least, would go to Russia. And the question is, would there be more of Ukraine that goes to Russia?
Odessa?
I hope not. I really hope not.
Why do you say that? You say can't happen?
Well, I just don't. I hope that the West will at least stand up so that it does not become a landlocked country when this is all said and done.
But getting to this end game is going to take a long time. So you don't have to call me next year, probably, because probably we won't be there yet.
And so if it takes a long time, I mean, they're fighting. The Ukrainians are doing the fighting. We're not doing the fighting, and NATO troops are not doing the fighting. So if it takes a long time, it's going to be then. It means we supply them, the West supplies them for a long time, which would not be the first time that the West has supplied a indigenous military force for a long period of time.
Yeah.
And if they do it for a long period of time, we're kind of going to stalemate, and one that both sides say that there's nothing further for us in this arrangement. Let's talk. Does that make sense?
Well, I'd like to say that we're going to meet here again in a year, and you're all going to be here, and you're going to say, Johnson, you're wrong. And I would love that to happen. And, this lull in the fighting right now, let's hope that we're pouring a lot of weapons in. I understand they're using HIMARS now to knock out the bridges in that land bridge that the Russians have gotten down to Crimea, so that they can't use the roads to get in and out of Crimea. We saw that they were really, the Russians, quite a Potemkin military when they first started, and they couldn't take Kiev. They made several mistakes. They probably won't make those mistakes again. And when things start up again, when they do start up, that the Russians are more Potemkin than we even realized, and the Ukrainians can pull another rabbit out of the hat. But I'm not optimistic. I'd love to see that happen, but I don't see that the things are going along in a way that'll make that happen. The amount of support would be a tremendous amount, and I just don't see that being shipped in there.
It occurs to me, Susan, we're talking about territory and how much can be given up and how much is satisfactory to the invader and what's satisfactory to the sovereign nation of the Ukraine. It's a little bit different, although the historical ties between the Ukraine and the Russians are pretty strong. You go back a long time, although not quite as strong as Taiwan and China. Similar problem there, ultimately, Taiwan and China, that what we have here, we learn something here that will help us in the Taiwan problem.
Well, I really hope so, because that would be even worse than what we see here. And, you know, Chinese would tell you and have told me recently, Taiwan is much more important to China than Ukraine is to Russia. So that's something, you know, to bear in mind.
And that in itself is another reason why the West should find a way to muster the will and resources that it takes to
Show the Chinese what we're willing to do.
And so that's another dynamic in the chess game that I think we should pay attention to, and that I would hope would harden our resolve. But again, I don't see that happening. The other thing to remember is that in 1991, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, the third largest nuclear power in the world was Ukraine. And we worked very hard, we, the United States and the West, to convince them to sign a piece of paper in Budapest in December of 1994, giving back all of their nuclear weapons to Russia. And as a result, they've been invaded 20 years later, almost 30 years later. And that message to North Korea, to Iran, to all the other nuclear wannabes is going to be a proliferation issue that I think is going to plague our world in the coming years. And what's going on right now in Ukraine is not going to help that. And it's going to be an issue that our good friends at the State Department are going to have to deal with. And it's going to be a hard one. So there's lots of things coming out of this second and third order issues, Taiwan, nuclear proliferation and what have you, that tell us that we should and we must continue to try to, I don't want to say defeat, but to get to a situation where we can have some kind of a reasonable treaty that's close to the 23rd of February.
For students of history, what do you think would have happened if prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, NATO and US troops, NATO troops, had gone into Ukraine in advance? I know at the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the United States put up a strong defense, the Russians blinked, backed off, Khrushchev got fired. Do you think that scenario would have worked had we gone into Ukraine with military forces prior to the invasion?
Well, I think it would have helped. They weren't a NATO country, so I don't think we would have gotten our NATO allies to agree to do that. I think we could have done a whole lot more, though, in preparing the Ukrainians for this possibility, and we didn't. We did a lot once it started and bringing NATO together and what have you, but in terms of military hardware that could truly defeat them, we started pouring it in when they really needed it. Not until after they needed it. So if we had done it proactively and built up their military considerably, that could have helped. But I think that could have also triggered an earlier event than what happened on the 24th of April. It maybe would have been in the 1st of November in 2021 if we'd built up.
I don't think that would have prevented Putin from going in and doing what he did in Ukraine. It probably just would have made it more urgent on his part to go in and do that. So I'm not sure that deploying our troops in Ukraine would have been, also on the Cuban Missile Crisis, not that many people know that there was a compromise deal there in the Cuban Missile Crisis where the Russians, of course, withdrew from Cuba, but we also took missiles out of Turkey as part of the deal in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So not that many people know that there was a kind of a quid pro quo there, and it was a compromise deal that addressed some of the Soviet concerns at the time, or the major Soviet concern at the time.
Well, one other critical difference. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States was able to marshal huge, overwhelming public opinion in behalf of a hard stand. Why? It was 90 miles away. It was 90 miles away. Putin can say the same thing to the Russian people. This is our Cuba. These people are talking about NATO in an area 100 miles from the Russian border. So it's in reverse. Anyway, sorry. Next.
A simple question. You just raised it's only 100 miles away from the Russian border, but all the force is being exercised in Ukraine. Why is there no force being exercised by Ukraine in Russia and outside the Russian border? What's the thinking about why that doesn't happen, and increasing the pressure on the Russian people by exerting force within the Russian territory?
Well, from my standpoint, they have to husband their force. They don't really have that good of an offensive capability. You would need, mechanized artillery and a lot more tanks, and you'd have to establish some kind of air superiority, and they haven't been able to do that over Russia. They could conceivably launch some rockets in there, and they have been some, but they don't have the wherewithal to take offense into Russia, in my military opinion.
It's also escalatory, right? So
Yeah.
this is part of the narrative battle. The Ukrainians, everyone says the Ukrainians have done such a tremendous
They want to be
job
the
on their
victims.
PR and on their marshaling support from around the world. And if they were to sort of cross the line and go into offensive operations against Russia, they worry that they would lose, the storyline, the narrative line that is so compelling for everyone around the world.
Thank you very much. Just a question, you spoke a little bit about how Russia in this country is sort of in the proverbial doghouse at the moment, with so much of this country being behind Ukraine. Just wondering, in my area of sort of international Arctic environmental politics, we've cut Russia out largely, completely. I was at a conference speaking on the 23rd of February, and we had Ambassador get up at the front of the stage and be like, all right, we're done. And that was a cutoff. Haven't spoken with Russian colleagues since, but lots of projects, especially in the Arctic, where Russia is such a big area. How do we reopen those negotiations where, yes, we have the issues with Ukraine, where we're talking a lot about sort of grain and with Russia and oil, but in terms of the sort of diplomatic relations, the scientific relations, the art relations, how do we start making those kind of inroads, and at what point do we do that? And given that this has been a 20-year series of testing limits.
And it's a very good question, and I think you got to remember Russia is one of the permanent 5 members in the UN Security Council. So with Russia being treated as a pariah in the international community, which I'm not saying it shouldn't be, it is a pariah, being under such significant sanctions, it is almost impossible to do business with them without transgressing some of these lines. We are working with the Russians still on this hopefully not ill-fated project to try to get the Iranians back into this nuclear agreement that we had under the Obama administration. The Russians have been working, they've been sending their diplomats. So there are areas where, in the guise of, a major power that's part of, an important effort on something completely unrelated to Russia-Ukraine, we've managed to find some kind of modus vivendi to deal with them. But it's going to be very far and few between, I think, in the next period of time. And if this drags on, as unfortunately we've all both been talking about, it could be a very long period, of ostracizing Russia, basically isolating them. And how will the UN function without one of the main participants there? They tend to be a disruptor in that forum, but they also have very talented diplomats and a lot of capacity, and they do a lot of things around the world that, contribute to these institutions that I talked about that nobody seems to care about anymore. So on climate change, they're an incredibly important player, and they haven't done a very good job, and it's going to be crucial to sort of where we go and the energy picture and all of that. So we can't just, we're going to have, this is going to present a lot of problems for us, I predict, and it already is presenting some problems for sure.
I think this is on topic. Norway, does it have the natural resource capacity and the political will to increase its output of fossil fuel energy to support Europe, substitute for Russian fuel?
I can take a crack at that, and if you know
Yeah.
something about the capacity of Norwegian deep offshore drilling that's not tapped, please come in. But I think the Europeans are doing it, I mean, you said Germany is, not shipping the artillery pieces and other things that they've promised to the Ukrainians fast enough. One thing they are doing incredibly fast is moving away from Russian gas and oil. And, it's a huge move, and they're under the gun. But they're looking all around the world for every possible substitute source. They're getting more American LNG. They're, making trips to Qatar and other places to try to get energy. I'm sure if Norway can pump more and send it to Europe, they will. But it's not that easy, first of all, to put on new capacity. And then there may be questions about kind of what kind of crude comes out there and what are the markets and how can they get it and can the Germans use it. But I think the Germans are doing everything they possibly can, including using putting online a lot of renewables much faster than maybe they would have otherwise. I mean, they're trying to do everything they possibly can, but they're still going to have a cold winter, I'm afraid.
I was struck by Dr. Thornton's statement about we don't always think ahead to the consequences of our act. And following up on Susanna's important point about the environment, I'm wondering if you've given any thought to how this might well be seen in the long run as a diversion from what really faces us with respect to dealing with the climate and what effect that's going to have on our willingness to continue this power politics that we've been involved in.
Well, we have Dr. Nirav Shah in the audience, and this is the second diversion from climate change attention. The first one is the pandemic, of course, which sucked up all kinds of resources, unfortunately, from countries around the world, and it has been a huge diversion from attacking this, what I think is, the thing that we should be coming together over and focusing on. It somehow isn't compelling enough for people, and that's a problem. We talked a little bit about democratic politics. I mean, we're very reactive, not long-term thinking. This is something that comes up all the time in the context of US-China relations, where people keep lauding how good the Chinese are at having long-term strategies of matching their policy moves to their long-term interests, and not so much values, which is one of the things we factor a lot into our policies and comes as part of this reaction to things. We have kind of a knee-jerk reaction instead of maybe thinking harder and longer and more nuanced ways about the priorities and what we should be trying to aim toward for the long haul. But we have to help the Ukrainians. I think it's clear. So we, as the global leader, we deal with what's thrown at us, and that is also something, as Greg said, we need to find a new national purpose in the world, because we can't keep being the world policeman 911 for everybody and everything. We're just not going to be able to keep doing that, and we need help, and we need to figure out how to change that. So that's a huge, mission, but hope you all are on board for it, because we're going to need everybody on deck for that.
Does the nuclear threat from Putin still exist?
Well, I think it's a very credible threat. And they do have a declaratory policy. They've always had a strategy that included the use of tactical nuclear weapons. They still have a wide array of tactical nuclear weapons. We've decommissioned most of our so-called tactical nuclear weapons. And so, yes, I think it is a threat.
Yeah, it might even be a bigger threat now than it was in the Cold War, because of the unpredictability and Putin's kind of level of risk tolerance. It may be worse than.
Well, I think this is going to be a very difficult issue going forward.
I just have one thing to say. This has been very interesting, and thank you both very much. One thing that wasn't on the agenda, which really controls everything we're talking about, is politics. And it's unfortunate today that self-interest seems to be what motivates everybody. Very few people, very few of these politicians, very few, think in terms of national interest. It wasn't always that way. There were people, politicians with self-interest, but there were also plenty of them with national interest on their mind. I want to close by, I worked in the White House, I was there in 1965, when President Johnson ordered the Marines to go to Santo Domingo and occupy Santo Domingo. And a month later, these telephone tapes, LBJ telephone tapes, are absolutely terrific. Real history. And you can go online and get these tapes. And on a month later, on the 23rd of May, 1965, President Johnson was on the phone with McGeorge Bundy, his national security advisor, and Abe Fortas, his close personal friend and private advisor. And he said, and now the troops had been there for a month in Santo Domingo. And he said, now, I don't always know what's right. Imagine an American politician saying that in this day and age. Here's the President of the United States. Now, I don't always know what's right. Sometimes I take other people's judgment and I get misled. Like sending troops in there to Santo Domingo. But the man who misled me was Lyndon Johnson, nobody else. Accountability. And we talk about all these things, but ultimately, it's up to leaders. And
Leadership.
that's where the problem is. Thank you very much.